Federal Reserve System is a strange creature. It's easier to say what it is not. People think it's a government agency. It is not. Those who have studied it say, well, wait a minute, this is a private banking corporation. You almost get half credit for that, but it's not really a private corporation either. It's a hybrid. And to make it more complicated, we can say it is a cartel. This is the amazing thing. The Federal Reserve System is a banking cartel. You see, with most cartels, if a member of the cartel wants to break out or violate the agreement, if they fixed prices, for example, and one of the members of the cartel wants to raise the prices contrary to the agreement, there's no way for them to discipline the member of the cartel and force him to stick with the agreement. But if you bring the government into the arrangement and convert the agreement into law, now all members are required by law to keep the agreement or they go to jail. So this is why cartels always, throughout history, have always tried to form a partnership with the government, whatever government is in the locale where they operate. And so we come to the amazing conclusion that the Federal Reserve System is basically a cartel, a banking cartel, that has gone into partnership with the federal government of the United States. And the government has given it a monopoly, a virtual monopoly, to create the nation's money supply. The purpose of the Federal Reserve System really is to protect the large member banks from competition and to preserve their profit margins. And as we've seen in late, when some of the banks get into trouble, the purpose of the Federal Reserve System comes to the fore, which is to pass on the losses of the banks to the taxpayers. They do this through Congress, generally. Remember, Congress is a partner with the Federal Reserve System. And they go to Congress and they say, well, the banks are in trouble. Now, we don't want the banks to fold because that would be bad for the economy, right? That would be bad for you folks. And so, since it's for you folks that we're doing this, the congressmen kick in the extra money to bail out the banks, to guarantee the loans, to guarantee the interest payments from the countries that are going bankrupt and can't make their interest payments to the bank and so forth, whether it's Mexico or China or Russia or some country in Africa or Asia. They cannot pay, so they come to Congress. Congress says, we'll pay for them. And it seems like it's a humanitarian thing, when in reality, all they're doing is transferring tax dollars from you and from me to these countries so they can continue to make interest payments to the banks so the banks don't have to write off these loans as bad loans. So that's another purpose of the Federal Reserve System, is to pass off the losses of the cartel members to the taxpayers. And most people don't realize that, but when you see how it has operated over the years, it's very clear. The purpose of the Federal Reserve System is to promote the best interests of the banking members of the cartel.
When you suggest to people that their money should be gold or silver coin, as it says in the Constitution, they sometimes stare at you with a blank expression or make the most extraordinary comments. So, what's going on here? Why does the Constitution clearly state that our money shall be coin, yet we are using government-issued, supposedly official, paper dollar bills? Bear in mind that each one of the Federal Reserve Banks is basically a private corporation.
This is an absolute contradiction of the Constitution to have a Federal Reserve System and a central bank. I consider the Federal Reserve Act and the creation of the Federal Reserve as being unconstitutional. It gave the government then the power to create legal tender out of thin air. So it was very, very special interest directed, and it was designed for the elite.
They called the Jekyll Island Club. And its members were a relatively small group of billionaires from New York. People like J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller and their business associates. And they created the Federal Reserve.
Hopefully someday people here in Washington, especially the members of the Banking Committee, will gain some interest in this subject, because ultimately we will have to address it. But a fiat monetary system or a paper money system is merely a system where the government has this power and authority to dictate and insist that a piece of paper is legal tender. And even members of the banking committee have come up to me and they said, "You mean our dollar isn't backed by gold anymore?" Not realizing that the Federal Reserve really accommodates big government bureaucrats and politicians.
Does this sound like a Thomas Jefferson operation? Does this so-called Federal Reserve System sound like something Ben Franklin, the man who invented the pot-bellied stove and co-authored the Constitution, would set up? Or does this system sound more like something George Orwell would write about in his nightmare book, 1984?
I've often heard it said that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that humans are causing a catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many that simply think that is not true.
The IPCC is a political organisation set up by the United Nations to provide evidence to support the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been signed by governments. It's entirely political.
And to build the number up to 2,500, they have to start taking reviewers and government people and so on, anyone who ever came close to them.
A few years ago, I decided to look more closely at the science, and it astonished me. In fact, there is no evidence of humans being the cause.
Notice they kept the two graphs separate. By doing so, the human eye perceives that CO2 causes temperature to rise. However, when the temperature graph is superimposed over the CO2 graph, it becomes apparent that CO2 tends to follow temperature, not precede it, strongly suggesting that the CO2 does not cause the temperature to change, but the temperature causes CO2 to change.
When we look at the ice core record, here from Vostok in Antarctica, we see that the temperature record and the CO2 record from these ancient atmospheres follow very closely one to another. But when we look more closely at the detail, we see that the temperature record increases first. The CO2 record lags the temperature by up to 800 years.
It has been known since the early 20th century that there appears to be a correlation between cosmic radiation and low elevation cloudiness. The more cosmic radiation, the more cloud formation. Several Danish scientists led by Hendrik Sevensmark confirmed that relation in the early 1990s and found the correlation to be highly significant. They then developed a working hypothesis. When a sun goes supernova, it emits a burst of cosmic radiation. As that radiation reaches the Earth thousands of years later, it interacts with atmospheric atoms and frees electrons, which then act to bring water vapor molecules together, which finally condenses out into water droplets in the lower atmosphere, which creates clouds. Low elevation clouds are highly reflective and reflect the sun's energy back out into space.
When we've looked at the literature on experiments that have been done with increasing levels of carbon dioxide, what we basically find is that most plants respond the same way. More carbon dioxide gives us more biomass. So if we look at a forest, a rangeland, a marsh, a wetland, or an agricultural field, what's really happening with more CO2 is that you have more plant material produced.
Increased CO2 worldwide, with few exceptions, means plants grow better, period.
This will change some of the ecosystems. It may allow some plants to grow in areas that now would be considered marginal for the growth of those plants.
All these treaties are dangerous attacks on American freedoms, national security, land ownership, and private property, or our use of natural resources and energy, or our land. And together they add up to what is meant by global governance.
Yes, Senator, it's a global problem and it has to be solved with a global strategy. But this is the rare but all-important global or strategic problem. Its aspect is in the global dimension, and every nation has to be a part of the solution.
The environment is being used for a power struggle. The environment is being used for centralized government. The environment is being used to make a one-world government. This is an awakening call, that we are facing a battle against those that want to destroy a great United States of America.